Two social workers sat behind a desk, looking across the table at a very nervous-looking couple. The social workers tackled troubling cases all the time, but this one was especially hard to stomach. That day, a doctor had called the social workers about an infant that the doctor was sure was being abused. He said this case was very serious, and he wanted the social workers to come and take custody of this child right now, before anybody else could hurt this little girl again. The social workers had gone over to the hospital right away, and the evidence the doctor showed them was truly shocking. From what they could see, this 3-month-old baby hadn't just been hurt once, but many, many times. The parents denied doing anything to their child, and talked about how much they cared for their child, but the social workers had seen plenty of crocodile tears before, and so they knew whatever happened next, this couple would not be going home with their baby. And frankly, if the social workers had their way, these parents would never come anywhere near their baby ever again. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So if you like today's story, please replace the Follow Button's toothpaste with garlic paste. This episode is called Glass Baby. On the morning of June 16th, 2008, Tiffany O'Shell was washing dishes in the kitchen when she heard a familiar rustling sound coming through the baby monitor on the counter. Her 3-month-old daughter, Alyssa, had just woken up. Tiffany dried her hands on a towel, then took off the bandana that had been keeping her short red hair out of her face. She heard Alyssa start to hiccup on the monitor, and instinctively, Tiffany almost called out for her husband, Dave, to go check on the baby, but then she remembered that Dave had actually already left for work. He was a police officer with the Lakewood Police Department in Lakewood, Colorado. Tiffany used to work with Dave at the Lakewood Police Department, but she'd quit a couple of months before Alyssa was born. Having 2 full-time cops in the family was too hard with a new baby. Now she just worked part-time as a guard at a halfway house for former criminals. It didn't pay as much as being a full-time cop, but the hours were far more flexible. Tiffany walked into the baby's room and gently took Alyssa from her crib. Alyssa's bright blue eyes darted around the room, taking in her little world. Tiffany brushed a hand over Alyssa's mop of bright red hair and smiled. It was the same shade as Tiffany's hair. Tiffany could tell that Alyssa needed a new diaper, and so she carried her over to the changing table beneath the nursery window. Tiffany began to undo her baby's onesie, but when Tiffany lifted Alyssa's right leg up, her baby girl let out a sharp cry. As the baby cried and cried, Tiffany picked her up and examined her, unsure what had upset her baby so much. But the more Tiffany touched Alyssa, the more the baby seemed to cry. Tiffany tried to shift her from one hip to the other, but that just made Alyssa scream even louder. At a loss for what to do, Tiffany just took her baby into the living room where they kept Alyssa's swing, and she fastened Alyssa into the swing and let it rock her, and soon the crying did stop, and a few minutes later, Alyssa was fast asleep. Tiffany was relieved, however she was still concerned, but she decided that Alyssa's sudden distress couldn't be anything serious, and so Tiffany went back to her morning chores. After Tiffany showered and dressed, she loaded Alyssa into her car to drop her off with her grandmother, Jackie, Tiffany's mom. Jackie was going to babysit Alyssa until Dave finished his shift that evening. Alyssa slept peacefully the entire car ride, and she didn't even wake up as Tiffany took her out of the car and handed her over to her grandma, so Tiffany assured herself that her daughter must be okay. It was late evening by the time Tiffany got home from work. She set her purse down in the entryway and then went into the kitchen to start dinner. Meanwhile, in the living room, Dave was trying to play with Alyssa, but from the sound of it, it seemed like Alyssa was really fussy. A minute later, Dave stood up and carried Alyssa into the kitchen so they could say hello to Tiffany. Tiffany asked Dave how his day went, and he would say it was all good, typical day. But then he said when he picked up Alyssa from Jackie, Tiffany's mom, Jackie mentioned that Alyssa had actually been a bit fussier than usual all day. Tiffany nodded and told Dave about Alyssa's outburst that morning when she lifted up her leg. Dave bit his lip and looked concerned. Tiffany waited to hear what he was thinking. Dave wondered aloud if they should take Alyssa to the doctor if her mood didn't improve by morning. And then in the meantime, Dave told Tiffany he would make dinner that night, and Tiffany should just go play with Alyssa because maybe what she really needs is just time with mommy. But the next morning, Alyssa did not seem better. When she woke up, Tiffany noticed that the baby's right leg was now swollen. Tiffany was totally alarmed by this. This was the same leg that was bothering Alyssa the day before. But Tiffany couldn't imagine what would have caused it to puff up so badly overnight. Very gently, Tiffany ran her finger along Alyssa's swollen leg, and the baby immediately let out a high-pitched scream. At this point, Tiffany knew she had to bring Alyssa to the doctor. By that afternoon, Tiffany was sitting in the emergency room at the Denver Children's Hospital. She was on the phone with her husband Dave, explaining that their baby's regular pediatrician didn't know why Alyssa's leg was swelling, and they had sent her to the hospital for more complete x-rays. Now, Tiffany was waiting for a doctor to come back with the results. Dave told Tiffany that he was actually in the area on patrol, and he would just swing by the hospital. A few minutes later, Tiffany was looking out the window when she saw Dave's patrol car pull into the parking lot. Dave hopped out and walked into the emergency room, and his worried face broke into a smile when he saw his wife. He walked over to her and sat down and asked her how she was doing. But before Tiffany could say anything, a doctor carrying their baby's x-rays walked into the waiting room with a very grave look on his face. He asked Tiffany and Dave to please follow him, and then without waiting for them, he just turned around and walked into an empty exam room. Tiffany felt her chest tighten. When she'd first met this doctor, he'd seemed really friendly, but now he seemed cold and distant, like he was preparing himself for a very difficult conversation. She looked to Dave for encouragement, but Dave just kind of shrugged and whispered that, maybe the doctor was having a bad day. A nurse was already sitting in the room when Tiffany entered carrying Alyssa, and then once she and her husband were inside the room, the doctor got up and closed the door behind them. Then he told Tiffany and Dave very matter-of-factly that he'd looked at Alyssa's x-rays, and he discovered that she had 11 bone fractures in both of her legs, all in various stages of healing. They would have to fit Alyssa for splints on both legs. These splints would keep her legs in place and help the fractures heal. Tiffany was totally shocked, and she instinctively turned to her husband, but he also looked totally shocked. Tiffany then turned to the doctor and asked what he meant. Surely this was a mistake. The doctor didn't answer. Instead, he clipped Alyssa's x-rays to the light board on the wall and started pointing to all the dark lines across the child's bones. Each of the lines represented a fracture. Tiffany and Dave looked at the x-rays and then back at each other in absolute horror. Then Tiffany said to the doctor and the nurse that she and Dave were both incredibly gentle with their baby and very attentive to her every whine and cry, and so she didn't understand how they could have missed these injuries. The doctor frowned and said that so many bone fractures were a huge red flag, and he said he'd actually already called the Adams County Human Services Department, and they were actually waiting for Tiffany and Dave right now in the hallway, and they wanted to ask them some questions. Tiffany could scarcely find any words to respond, and so she just kind of nodded and said she would do anything to help her baby. But then the nurse who was in the room came across and tried to take Alyssa from Tiffany's arms, and suddenly it dawned on Tiffany and Dave that the doctor and really the staff at the hospital must suspect them of child abuse. And so not only was their baby seriously hurt, but now she might also be taken away from them. Tiffany's breath quickened as she turned back to look at her husband, who'd now gone white as a sheet. She couldn't believe this was happening. All she wanted to do was grab her baby back and run out the door. But instead, she ended up letting the nurse take Alyssa away from her, and then she and Dave walked out into the hallway where the two social workers were waiting for them. 2 hours later, Tiffany was back home with Dave, but without their baby. The parents sat at the kitchen table, Tiffany weeping uncontrollably and going over what happened at the hospital. After the doctor had spoken to them, a woman in a brown polyester suit had led Tiffany into a dingy conference room and spent the next 45 minutes grilling her on her mothering habits and her temperament. Then she had told Tiffany that the state social workers were not going to let her and Dave take their baby home. Tiffany begged them not to take her child, but nothing she said made a difference. The social workers had already decided that it was in the best interest for the baby for her to be put in foster care. They wouldn't consider leaving Alyssa with Tiffany's mom either, since Jackie often babysat for Alyssa and therefore was a potential suspect as well if this was abuse. Tiffany was a wreck and felt like her heart had been pulled out of her chest. Meanwhile, her husband, Dave, was just furious. He kept pounding his fist on the granite countertop as Tiffany sobbed right next to him. The parents had told the doctor again and again that nobody in their family would ever hurt Alyssa. But the doctor said that Alyssa had what are called corner fractures, which would have been from violently yanking or twisting Alyssa's limbs, which is consistent with abuse. During her interview, Tiffany had tried hard to think of some explanation for Alyssa's injuries. She'd mentioned that maybe every once in a while Dave would hold Alyssa upside down, kind of as a joke, but she assured the social worker that Alyssa was giggling and laughing the whole time, and Dave only did it for like a second or two. There was no way that could have caused all these fractures in her legs. As Tiffany went over and over all the horrible things that had gone on that day, she just got up from the kitchen table and began pacing. Now she was worried that she might have accidentally said too much about the way they parented Alyssa, and that maybe she had unintentionally given more ammunition to the social workers to potentially charge them with child abuse. Tiffany and Dave would spend the rest of the night combing the internet for some explanation for Alyssa's injuries. Finally, after hours of researching, they found a condition called brittle bone disease, a rare genetic condition that causes bones to weaken and snap easily. Although Tiffany shuddered at the thought that their baby could have such an agonizing condition, she did hope that they had found something other than abuse that could explain their baby's injuries. At this point, all Tiffany and Dave cared about was just getting their daughter back. In terms of how to protect her and keep her safe from more fractures, that was something they could figure out down the road. But for now, they just wanted their kid back. 2 days later, on June 19th, Tiffany and Dave stood at a defendant's table at the Adams County Courthouse for a hearing on the next steps in their baby's case. Across the small courtroom were the two social workers who'd interviewed Tiffany and Dave at the hospital 2 days earlier. Tiffany's blood boiled when she looked over at them. She knew they were just doing their jobs, but she couldn't help feeling totally furious inside. She tried to stay calm, but she worried whether Dave could do the same. At home, he was an emotional wreck, full of rage and heartbreak at the same time. He'd barely been able to get dressed just to come to this hearing. When the hearing finally began, Tiffany's hands shook as she pulled her internet research out of her purse. She handed the printouts to the bailiff, who then walked them over to the judge. While the judge scanned the research, Tiffany began to explain how much she and Dave loved their daughter, and she begged the judge to please make the hospital test their baby for brittle bone disease. Then Tiffany did her best to remain calm, while the social workers argued that because of how the breaks in Alyssa's leg looked, there was almost no chance she had brittle bone disease. Instead, they felt that Alyssa's injuries were absolutely from non-accidental trauma. In other words, they were saying Tiffany and Dave had purposefully harmed their daughter. This suggestion made Tiffany feel sick, and the social workers' attitudes enraged her. It would be so easy to test Alyssa for brittle bone disease or any other possible medical reasons for all these leg fractures, but it just seemed like they were outright refusing, and they weren't even doctors. It felt outrageous for them to dismiss her concerns so out of hand. It seemed to Tiffany that the social workers were far more concerned with being proven right than they were about just reuniting a baby with her family. Tiffany was fighting back tears until she heard the judge say that other causes should be explored. Relief washed over Tiffany as the judge ordered emergency medical testing for their baby. Tiffany was so relieved that she felt lightheaded. For the first time in 2 days, it felt like she could finally breathe again. But the judge did say that Alyssa would have to remain in foster care until that new testing was done. Tiffany nodded and took Dave's hand, doing her best to maintain her composure. The last thing she needed right now was to come off as unstable. At least now she had a glimmer of hope that soon they would know what actually happened to Alyssa, and hopefully she'd be allowed to come back home where she belonged. The next morning, Tiffany was in her kitchen pouring water into the coffee maker for her and Dave. Dave was so depressed that he'd called in sick for work and had not gotten out of bed. Tiffany was up, but yawning from exhaustion after another sleepless night. Then the phone rang, and any hope that their life was about to return to normal flew out the window. It was a nurse from the hospital who was calling, and she told Tiffany that the social workers had scheduled Alyssa's emergency medical testing. However, they had scheduled it for early October, more than 3 months away. Tiffany could not believe it. Tiffany knew the social workers were trying to put off the tests as long as possible because they were already convinced that she and Dave were the ones abusing Alyssa. Tiffany knew the tests they were going to do would very likely prove that she and Dave really were innocent, but now they had to wait 3 months to do those tests? These were 3 months they could never get back with their daughter who was so young they needed to be with her. A week later, on the evening of June 26th, Dave couldn't stop his hands from shaking as he left work. He was on his way to visit Tiffany's grandfather, Charles Cooper. The two had become close friends over the years. Charles was a great listener, and the two men could discuss just about anything as they played pool and drank beer in Charles's basement. Dave was in a dark mood as he knocked on Charles's door. Then, after Charles opened it up and welcomed Dave inside, Dave followed the older man downstairs. Charles then handed Dave a beer and asked how he and Tiffany were holding up, and Dave immediately started talking a mile a minute. He said things were getting worse and worse and worse. He told Charles that he'd heard through the grapevine at the police station that Alyssa's social workers believed that he, Dave, was the one who'd broken Alyssa's legs. And if that was true, he would be charged with child abuse, which was a felony. Which meant there was a very real chance that in a matter of days, Dave was going to be arrested. And the reality of this was so overwhelming, Dave felt like he was losing his mind. Charles just shook his head in disbelief and asked what had made Dave the lead suspect. But Dave just shrugged. All day, he had been replaying in his mind the interview he had done at the hospital with the social worker, and the only thing he could think of that made him look kind of guilty was the fact that both he and Tiffany had mentioned that Dave periodically held his daughter upside down just to make her laugh. David stressed that he did this totally gently, but clearly the social workers did not believe him, and they thought that whatever Dave was doing when he flipped his daughter upside down was hurting her. Charles walked over and gave Dave a hug and told him to just keep the faith. But Dave shook his head. In a little more than a week, he'd gone from being the proud father of a happy family to an alleged child abuser facing a steep prison sentence. Dave took a sip of his beer and told Charles that he was terrified of going to prison. He'd heard horror stories of what happened to cops who wound up behind bars, and he was also scared that Tiffany would leave him if he was incarcerated. Charles tried to offer some comfort, but Dave was just too upset and scared to be reasoned with. Dave knew enough about the criminal justice system to understand that he would need money for a good lawyer, plus about $50,000 for bail, and if he did really go to trial and was found guilty, he'd lose his job, he'd lose his house, he'd lose his family. He just knew this whole ordeal was going to totally destroy him. Dave apologized to Charles and said he just needed to go. He wanted to be home with his wife, or maybe walk the neighborhood and clear his head. And without another word, Dave hopped up, he jogged up the basement stairs, and left out the front door of the house. 2 days later, Tiffany was at her parents' house for breakfast. She tried to eat, but mostly she just moved the food around her plate. She told her parents that she was really worried about her husband. Over the past couple of days, he'd been growing more and more despondent, and he didn't want to talk. He was convinced that his life was about to be over. Tiffany was trying to be strong and hold their family together, but it was proving to be a nearly impossible task, because as much as she wanted to reassure Dave, she was growing increasingly worried too. She told her parents that she had to be realistic. Even if she was not charged with abuse, Dave's legal fees could cost them their house. And if he went to prison, she couldn't afford to live on her own. She'd be a single mother raising Alyssa in her parents' basement. Tiffany turned to her father, Paul, and begged him to please help her save her family. She didn't know what they could do exactly. Her parents didn't have a ton of money, and nobody could convince the social workers to remove Alyssa from foster care. But Tiffany was desperate. All she wanted was to hear her parents say everything is going to be okay. Paul laid his hand on Tiffany's forearm and promised her he would do everything he could. But realistically, the gesture just didn't make Tiffany feel any better. She felt like if she wanted to save her family, she'd have to do it herself. A few hours later, Tiffany sat inside of a small beige office in Denver with a dark wood desk and matching bookshelves. The shelves were cluttered with legal books, an old encyclopedia set, and all sorts of awards and honors. Behind the desk, an older attorney with a balding head sat leafing through Alyssa's case file. After talking with her parents that morning, Tiffany had realized she really needed to start looking out for herself and Alyssa in case Dave did go to jail. So she'd made this appointment in the hopes that this lawyer could help her get her child back. The lawyer kept periodically rapping his knuckles on his desk like he was totally lost in thought trying to think something through, to the point where Tiffany wondered if he'd actually forgotten she was in his office too. But then the lawyer coughed and kind of leaned back in his leather chair and looked at Tiffany. Finally, he spoke. He told Tiffany he had an idea. She should file for divorce. Tiffany felt like she'd been punched. She just stared at the lawyer, saying nothing, expecting him to admit that somehow this had been a joke. But then the lawyer explained that no, in his professional opinion, Dave did not stand a chance and was going to be imprisoned. And so if she wanted any shot of getting custody of their baby once Dave was incarcerated, this was a necessary first step. Tiffany felt totally outraged. She wanted a lawyer who would help keep her family together, not try to break it up. She told the lawyer she did not need to think about this. There was no way she was going to do this. But the entire ride home, her mind just continued to race. She knew that Dave had never touched their baby, and certainly the court would have to see that too. She couldn't just abandon her husband. How would she even talk to him about a divorce? And yet, when it came to thinking about Alyssa, Tiffany was just not willing to leave anything to chance. Tiffany knew she had a big decision to make here. She just hoped that when the time came, she'd make the right one. 2 days later, Alyssa's foster mom rushed into the ER at the Denver Children's Hospital and asked to speak with the doctor, who initially saw Alyssa for bone fractures. Alyssa was in the foster mother's arms, and both her legs were still in splints, and she was crying as though she was in pain. The foster mom tried to rock Alyssa back and forth and shush her, but nothing seemed to be working. In fact, the foster mother would tell the medical team that Alyssa had been crying all morning no matter what she tried to do to calm her down. Finally, the doctor walked into the waiting room and he called the foster mother and Alyssa into an exam room. The doctor gingerly took Alyssa out of the foster mother's arms and asked what seemed to be the matter here. As Alyssa continued to cry, the foster mom stroked Alyssa's forehead and explained that she was really concerned about Alyssa's lack of development. Ever since she came to the foster house 2 weeks ago, she hadn't been moving her limbs very much. Plus, her legs still seemed extremely sensitive to the touch, like they were not healing at all. She'd also developed a rapid breathing pattern that sounded raspy and forced. The doctor nodded and told the foster mother that she had done the right thing in bringing the baby back to the hospital. The doctor laid Alyssa on a tiny examination table and then began gently moving the baby's arms and legs. And as he did this, and as Alyssa continued to cry, the doctor would tell the foster mother that it did seem like Alyssa did not have the reflexes she should be developing by 3 months of age. The foster mother watched as the doctor tried to get Alyssa to grasp his pen, but the baby could not hold it. The doctor turned back to the foster mom and told her that he wanted to run a few genetic tests. And in fact, these were the exact tests that Alyssa was supposed to receive by court order, but not for another 3 months. The doctor also mentioned to the foster mother that he was supposed to meet with Tiffany and Dave earlier that morning, but they had not shown up. And so he told the foster mother that he would be sure to update Tiffany and Dave on this new plan to run these new tests sooner, as soon as they talked again. While the doctor continued to examine Alyssa, her foster mom stepped into the hallway. She called the social workers on Alyssa's case to let them know that Alyssa was back at the ER and that the doctor did seem to think that something else could be going on here with the baby. The social worker thanked her and then promised they would update Alyssa's parents. The foster mom hung up and then went back into the room to wait. But about 30 minutes later, one of the social workers called back to say that they'd tried to contact Tiffany and Dave, but both their phones went right to voicemail. The foster mom nodded and said that she just hoped everything was okay. Around 3 p.m. that same afternoon, June 30th, Tiffany's mother, Jackie, was also trying to get a hold of Tiffany and Dave. She'd been calling them all morning, but neither had picked up. Their radio silence really worried Jackie. She knew the parents had several important meetings that day that they could not afford to miss. At 8 a.m., they had an appointment at the hospital about their child abuse case. Jackie had expected some kind of update afterwards, but had not heard a thing. Then, at 11 a.m., Dave was supposed to meet with his lawyer, who was going to take him to the police station to be questioned by the detective on Alyssa's case. Then, at 1 p.m., Tiffany had an appointment with her own lawyer. Tiffany had not updated Jackie about what she was going to do yet with regards to filing for divorce or not, and as much as it pained Jackie to admit this, she did think that Tiffany would have to divorce Dave in order to get her baby back. Tiffany had promised to stay in touch with her mom, Jackie, all throughout the day, but now it was going on 3 p.m. and Jackie hadn't heard a peep. Jackie called Tiffany and Dave's house and their cell phones again, but still nothing. Jackie went upstairs to her bedroom where her husband, Paul, was napping, and she tapped him on the shoulder. Paul woke up and asked if she'd heard from Tiffany, but Jackie just shook her head and said she didn't know where they were and couldn't get in touch with them. And then she suggested that, maybe Paul should drive over to their house and see if they were okay. Paul didn't hesitate. He jumped out of bed, grabbed the keys, and then he and Jackie headed out the door towards the car. A few minutes later, Jackie and Paul pulled up outside of their daughter's house, and immediately, Jackie got a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. Tiffany and Dave's cars were in the driveway, which meant they had to be home, and yet their dog was sitting on the front porch, as though she'd been waiting to be let in for hours. Jackie and Paul made their way to the front door and rang the bell, but nobody answered. Jackie's chest tightened as she pounded on the door and called to Tiffany and Dave, but nobody called back. Paul had brought along a spare set of keys, so he pulled them out of his pocket and he unlocked the front door. And the second they stepped inside of that house, Jackie sensed something was wrong. It was just too quiet. Paul went ahead of her and headed down the hallway to the bedroom. Jackie hung back in the foyer and just decided to call 911, and just seconds later, Jackie heard Paul let out a blood-curdling scream. Paul had just discovered his own daughter and her husband dead inside of their bedroom. There was no note, but it was obvious what had happened. Dave had shot and killed Tiffany, and then he had taken his own life. A week later, Alyssa's test results came back, and one thing was absolutely clear. She had never been abused by her parents. She was diagnosed not with brittle bone disease, like Tiffany and Dave had thought, but instead with something even more rare. The baby had spinal muscular atrophy, a debilitating genetic disease that causes muscles to steadily shrink and weaken. Tragically, there's no treatment for spinal muscular atrophy, and in newborns, the disease is always fatal. Doctors concluded that Alyssa's bone fractures either came during her birth or just from normal handling after birth. In short, Dave and Tiffany had done nothing wrong. But the situation had spiraled so out of control that Dave felt like there was just no more hope, that he'd never get his daughter back, that he'd have to go to jail, and that everybody would think he and his wife were child abusers when they really were not. And so this is very likely why he chose to end his life and his wife's life. It's just this horribly tragic thing that was totally avoidable. After Alyssa's diagnosis, the court would grant custody of Alyssa to Tiffany's parents, Jackie and Paul. But they never received an apology or any acknowledgement that Alyssa should have never been taken away from her parents. But for Jackie and Paul, their focus was on the baby, and over the next few months, they did their best to care for Alyssa. However, as the doctors had predicted, Alyssa grew progressively weaker and her body continued to break down, and by the time Alyssa was just 7 months old, the stress and pain were too much for her little body, and she would die in her grandparents' arms. In 2009, the Jameson family, which was Bobby, who was 44, Sherilyn, who was 40, and their daughter Madison, who was 6 years old, were living in Eufaula, Oklahoma on lakefront property. While they seemed to be living a simple and happy life, behind the scenes, their life was in turmoil. Bobby suffered from bad chronic back pain that he had as a result of a car accident that he was in 2003. Sherilyn was bipolar. She was medicated for it, but she didn't always take her meds, causing her to lash out at her family members, and it caused bouts of severe depression. Bobby and Sherilyn also believed that their house was haunted by 3 or 4 spirits who lived on their roof. Bobby was so convinced of this that he went to his pastor and asked where he could buy special bullets that he could shoot at these spirits. So for all of these reasons, the Jameson family was actually looking to leave their property in Eufaula and move somewhere else and hopefully start all over again, fresh, with a new shot at happiness. After the Jamesons would vanish, their family and friends would say, "We had no idea any of this was happening. We had no idea they were even considering a move." Now, this move they were considering was not a typical move. They were not looking to move into another house. They were looking to move onto a piece of property where they could place their storage container and live in the storage container until at some point they were going to build a house on a mountain and then move into the house. And they had actually already found a plot of land about 30 miles away from where they were currently living in a town called Red Oak. Now, the storage container itself that they planned on living in was actually sitting on their property in Eufaula. And it drew a lot of attention from the neighbors because Sherilyn would graffiti on it, "The neighbors have poisoned our cats. Witches don't like it when you kill their cats," because it turns out Sherilyn believed that she was a witch. So unsurprisingly, the neighbors avoided the Jameson family at all cost. Several weeks before the Jameson family went missing, they actually brought in a male boarder. So a guy that was going to live with them and help with manual labor in exchange for room and board. The boarder was a white supremacist that immediately took exception to Sherilyn, who was part Native American. And so anytime Bobby was out of the house, the white supremacist boarder would get into a fight with Sherilyn. And one day it came to a head and Sherilyn drew a gun on the boarder and said to leave the property or she was going to shoot him. The boarder refused to leave. And so Sherilyn began firing shots into the ground at his feet until he left. Now, once the Jameson family disappeared, this white supremacist boarder became one of the primary suspects. But when the FBI found him, he had a rock-solid alibi and was quickly crossed off the list of potential suspects. On October 8th, 2009, Bobby, Sherilyn, their daughter Madison, and their dog Maisie load up the truck and they start driving towards Red Oak. They were apparently going to go scout out this piece of property that they wanted to purchase to live on with the storage container. Now, according to family and friends, it was not uncommon for the Jamesons to vanish for several days at a time without telling anybody where they went. And it would turn out that they would go into the woods for these retreats where they would get away from technology in the city. When they were gone for a few days and no one had heard from them, no one thought twice about it. On top of this, Bobby and Sherilyn had informed Madison's school that they'd be pulling her out of class because they were going to be moving. So when Madison didn't show up for school, the school did not raise any alarms because they assumed she'd been pulled out of school. On October 16th, 2009, 8 days after the Jamesons had left their house to go scout out this property in Red Oak, a couple of hunters in the Panola Mountains, which is near Red Oak, found the Jamesons' truck parked on the side of the road. Now, these hunters are in the middle of nowhere, which means the truck is in the middle of nowhere. And so as they're walking over to it, they're expecting to see the owner of the truck. But as they get over to the truck, there is no owner anywhere. They called out a couple times to see if they could get this person's attention or whoever it was that owned it, and no one came over to them. They look in the truck and they see there is this very sick-looking dog sitting on the back seat. It would turn out it was the Jamesons' dog. It was Maisie. Now, the windows were up and the truck was locked, so the hunters called the police. Police show up, they break a window, and they get Maisie out of the truck. They give her food and water, and she would end up making a full recovery. They look in the vehicle and all of the Jamesons' personal effects are in there. Their phones, their wallets, their jackets, their clothes. Underneath the front seat was $32,000 of cash in a bank bag. Also, they found this weird letter written by Sherilyn to Bobby that was this 11-page hate letter that basically accused Bobby of being a hermit, which seems like a strange thing to ramble for 11 pages about, but either way. The police did an initial search of the area looking for the Jameson family, but they couldn't find them. And so the running theory was they must have pulled over and walked into the woods for some reason, got turned around, and they're just lost, and we need to go find them. The police were able to use the cell phones that had been left inside of the vehicle and were able to use their GPS locations and track where the phones had been before coming to rest inside of this vehicle. And they saw that the cell phones had actually gone up the trail a little ways. They had been up towards the top of the mountain for about 15 minutes before coming back down and then wound up in the truck where they were when they were found. So the police walk up the hill to where the GPS said they had been, and they find all these footprints that look to be Madison's because there's a child's footprint as well as probably Bobby's and Sherilyn's. But they're nowhere to be found, and there's no clue of where they went after being up there. When they started scanning through each of the cell phones to see if there was any information about where they might have gone, they found on Bobby's phone a picture of Madison that was taken up at that little location that the GPS took them. The picture of Madison has been hotly contested on the internet for a long time now. It's hard to tell in the image if Madison is happy or sad. It's also unclear based on her body language if her parents are taking the photo or if this was kind of staged by someone else. So between the GPS showing that they had been at the top of this mountain at one point, plus the picture of Madison confirming she had at least been up there, the police started this massive search with that section on the mountain where they had been standing as kind of the center point. And they searched all around the Panola Mountains. But after an extensive search of this new area, they didn't find anything. No new leads had come in, so ultimately the search was called off. 4 years later, in November of 2013, some hikers were in the Panola Mountains, about 5 kilometers, maybe a little bit less, from where the Jameson truck was found. And they come across skeletal remains of 3 individuals. It looked like 2 adults and a child. They were laying face down side by side, and it was clear that they were not complete skeletons, but there was enough there to know for sure that these are people. As soon as the police were called, everybody assumed this has to be the Jameson family. It would actually take almost a year before they were able to confirm that yes, those bones are in fact the Jameson family. While the Oklahoma medical examiner was not able to determine a cause of death because the remains were just partial, they didn't have enough to work with, they did see that there was a big hole in the back of Bobby's skull, and there was other holes in some of the other bones that many people assumed were from bullets, but it was never determined if that actually was what it was from. As soon as it came out that it was the Jameson family's remains, the first prominent theory was that this had to have been a murder-suicide, where Sherilyn, who was mad at Bobby, she wrote that hate-filled 11-page letter that was found in the car. You know, she's unstable from not taking her medication to combat her bipolar disorder. She seems like the person that would take her family out and then turn on herself. But all of her family said she would never harm her daughter. Maybe she would have harmed Bobby, but she never would have harmed her daughter. Also, why would you have brought your dog along and left your dog in the car and $32,000 of cash in the car? So that doesn't fit that scenario at all. The next theory was, well, maybe they just pulled over, walked into the woods for some reason, and then got lost and died of exposure. And that's still definitely a possible theory, except at the time they went missing, the temperatures were very mild. They were not dropping below freezing at night. It didn't rain very much, so it was kind of perfect conditions to be lost in the woods. It would have taken quite a while for them to die from exposure. And if you add in the fact that they were searching that area that they were found in pretty extensively within a few days of them going missing. If they had been lost and were only a few kilometers from the road, they would have been found in that search, but they weren't. The next theory that friends and family of the Jameson family predominantly believe is they were kidnapped. That maybe, they were driving on that road and someone flagged them down, whether it was someone they knew or someone that did not seem threatening, that caused them to get out of their car and come over to them, leaving their car the way it was with all of their belongings inside and with their dog inside, shut the door, they're not threatened. They walk over to this person or this group, and then something happens where they are either against their will or they're complicit, and they walk into the woods, never to go back to their truck, and then they ultimately pass away in the woods just a few kilometers away. However, none of those theories can account for the very bizarre video footage that they have of the Jameson family on the day they left their house to go check out the property in Red Oak. So on October 8th, 2009, the video shows Bobby and Sherilyn making multiple trips, about 20 or more, from their house to their truck, where they're loading gear into their truck. But they appear to be almost in a trance, which is what the sheriff said when he first saw the video. They're walking back and forth and they're carrying their stuff into the truck, but periodically they're making trips without carrying anything. They're just walking to the truck with nothing in hand, looking at the truck, and then walking back to the house. And then they come back out and they have something in their hands, and then the next trip they have nothing. And periodically on their trek back and forth, they would just stop and just turn and look off into the distance, not interacting with each other. Bobby and Sherilyn haven't spoken to each other at all. They're just doing this weird trance-like commute back and forth between truck and house before ultimately they load up the truck and they do leave. A lot of people speculated that, well, it looks like Bobby and Sherilyn must have been using drugs. But when they first found the truck and they searched the Jamison's truck and they searched the Jamison family house, there was no traces of drugs anywhere, and their family said there's no history of drug abuse. There was also a theory that perhaps the Jamison family got tied up in a cult, and that was why they were moving and they were going to live this minimalist lifestyle, and they had brought cash to, give to this cult, but in fact they had actually been the target of the cult, and that was what led to their demise. Or maybe they were complicit and they wanted to sacrifice themselves or something, but no one really knows.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Siberian Cabin.
When most people picture Russia in their minds, they picture European Russia, which is literally the part of Russia on the western side that sits in Europe and is by far the most populated part of the country. But European Russia only accounts for 23% of the total territory that is Russia. The other 77% is to the east of European Russia. It starts at the Ural mountain range and it extends all the way over 5 million square miles to the Pacific Ocean. And this vast, mostly forested expanse, which is 50 times bigger than the entire United Kingdom, is called Siberia. And Siberia is absolutely brutal. In Siberia, it is almost always freezing cold. Literally. The average annual temperature across all of Siberia is 32.9 degrees Fahrenheit. So it is 0.9 degrees above freezing on average every single day. In addition to the extremely deadly weather that exists basically year-round in Siberia, Siberia is also home to a bunch of huge deadly animals, such as the brown bear, which is the same as the infamous grizzly bear in North America, the gray wolf, which by size alone makes virtually all other wolves look like little puppies. Gray wolves can grow to be nearly 200 pounds. And of course, there is the highly intelligent Siberian tiger, who is perhaps one of the only predators on Earth that is known to seek out and kill people for revenge. For example, in 1997, a hunter named Vladimir Markov was walking through a Siberian forest when he came face to face with one of these Siberian tigers, and he ended up shooting the tiger before fleeing, except the tiger didn't die. Instead, it got up and secretly followed Vladimir all the way back to his cabin, and then this tiger camped out outside of the cabin until Vladimir came out again, and the tiger pounced, killed him, and ate him. And so unsurprisingly, Siberia has an absolutely minuscule population relative to its massive size. However, there are some adventurous people out there who are drawn to Siberia for the same reasons that most other people avoid it. These adventurous people see Siberia as one of the last truly wild places on our planet, and they want to experience it for themselves. And one of these highly adventurous people was a young man named Colin Madsen. Colin, who came from a very successful American family, was a big outdoors enthusiast who at some point in his youth began researching Siberia because he fell in love with its rugged natural beauty. He quickly began researching not only Siberia, but Siberian culture and Russian culture, and also at some point he became fluent in the Russian language. Then, in 2013, when Colin was 22 years old, he left his home in Missouri and moved to Siberia. He settled in one of Siberia's few population centers, a city called Irkutsk, which is located in the southeast of Siberia and right along the edge of Lake Baikal, which is the world's deepest freshwater lake. Colin's Siberia plan was twofold. He would go to school while he was there, and he would go out and explore. And at first, his plan went perfectly. He was accepted into Moscow State Linguistic University in Irkutsk, and very quickly he made friends who were eager to accompany him on his adventures out into the Siberian wilderness. From his arrival in Siberia in 2013 to 2016, Colin did well in his studies, and he spent countless hours exploring the forests and mountainous areas all around Lake Baikal and right outside of Irkutsk. In fact, Colin became so familiar with this region that he began volunteering with a nonprofit in the area that went around marking new trails, which meant Colin was literally venturing into the wilds of Siberia and just marking the trail as he went. So when Colin's family heard about what happened to him in 2016, they could not believe it. In March of 2016, Colin and 3 of his good hiking friends, one was American and 2 were Russian, decided they wanted to go on a hike together. They settled on hiking to the summit of Love Peak, which was a mountain located a few hours away from Irkutsk in a small village called Arshan. This hike was nothing compared to the gnarly Siberian wilderness hikes all 4 of these guys had been on before. The trail that led up to Love Peak, it was fairly steep, but it was incredibly well marked, and all 4 of these guys had hiked it several times before. However, because Colin and his friends were so experienced at hiking in Siberia, they knew that even the easiest hikes needed to be respected, because Siberia was still Siberia. There were dangers that lurked everywhere. And so the men called ahead to the village of Arshan, and they rented one of these small rustic cabins that's in the village that sits right at the base of Love Peak, and it's kind of tucked away in this forest. And so this cabin would serve as their sort of base camp and would allow them to arrive in Arshan, get their gear together, and then when they were ready, they could begin this hike to the summit. And so a few days later, on March 27th, Colin and his 3 friends loaded up their car and they drove west to Arshan. And when they got there, they stopped at a local store and got some supplies and then made their way to their cabin. Their cabin was just a single room with a few beds inside of it. It was enough to protect them from the elements, but really nothing more. As for a toilet, the cabin didn't have one, but there was an outhouse outside that they could use. So after the friends moved into the cabin and claimed their beds and put their things down, they all sat down and began prepping their gear and eating some food and chatting. And then finally, at 2 a.m., they decided they needed to go to sleep because their plan was to get on the path up to Love Peak by 7 a.m., which meant they needed to get up at 5 a.m. to make their final preparations. So at 2 a.m., the lights in the cabin turned off and the friends all fell asleep. And then 3 hours later at 5 a.m., when the lights came back on again, it was immediately clear something was wrong. Colin was not in his bed. His friends assumed when they looked over at his bed and saw his personal belongings were all still there, that Colin must have gotten up and headed outside, maybe to use the outhouse or go for a quick walk, and they just hadn't heard him leaving. And so the 3 friends initially just kind of shrugged off Colin's absence and said, he'll be back any minute, most likely. And if for some reason he's not back soon, he'll certainly be back by 7 a.m. because that was the agreed upon time they would leave for this hike. But as the minutes ticked closer and closer to 7 a.m. and Colin still had not shown up or tried to call them or do anything, the friends started to worry. It just didn't make any sense that Colin would just get up and leave without telling them where he was going. Finally, at 7 a.m., when Colin still had not shown up, and the friends' cursory search of the outside area near the cabin had yielded no results, they decided they had to tell someone. And so they wrote a note addressed to Colin, and they put it on the front of their cabin door. And this note basically just told Colin, if you come back here and you see this note, know that we're looking for you. So stay put or tell someone you're here. And so after putting up this note, the friends left the cabin and they headed to the nearest police station where they reported Colin missing. The police would eventually launch this huge search in and around Arshan, both in the forested area right around the village and then also up into the mountains near Love Peak. But despite this huge effort, no one could find Colin, at least not at first. On Monday, April 4th, so 8 days into Colin's disappearance, a group of searchers were looking in the forest about 1 mile away from the cabin where Colin and his friends had been staying, and they look up ahead and they see there is this clearing and there's something in the middle of it. And so the searchers begin moving their way towards this clearing, ducking under branches and stepping over brush, and when they get close enough, they can see Colin is in the clearing, and Colin is deceased. He was laying flat on his back with his left arm extended out to the side and his right arm extended but closer to his body, and both of his hands were clenched in tight fists. And on his hands and his wrists were visible abrasions and cuts, which later would be determined to have most likely been caused from someone or something holding onto him, trying to restrain Colin. Colin also had visible abrasions and cuts on the front of his neck. Colin's clothing, which consisted of a long-sleeve thermal shirt, heavy pants, and hiking boots, were ripped and torn in several places. And interestingly, Colin was not wearing socks under his boots. Now that seems inconsequential, but Colin had had surgery on both of his ankles and had scar tissue on his ankles that if he didn't have socks on, those scars would rub against the inside of his boot. And he said it was very painful. So he always wore socks. Also, Colin's body showed virtually no signs of decomposition, and all of his wounds and abrasions looked, quote, fresh, according to medical personnel. In short, Colin looked like he had recently been in some sort of physical altercation, and whoever or whatever he was grappling with had eventually overpowered him and killed him, although it was not clear how he actually died. Russian authorities were very quick to suspect Colin's 3 friends who had been with him, but they were brought into the station and they denied having anything to do with Colin's death, and they all passed their lie detector tests. After that, Russian authorities quickly closed this case by concluding that, well, if his friends didn't do it, then that means Colin must have been high on drugs or drinking alcohol or both, and he just wandered out of his cabin and he got lost in the woods and he died of hypothermia. He froze to death. The end. However, Colin's parents just could not accept that as being what happened to their son. There were a lot of reasons for skepticism, but the main one was that Colin was an absolute expert at navigating this particular region of Siberia. And so the idea that he would leave his cabin for a quick walk or something and get so completely lost that he would die 8 days later seemed way too far-fetched. And so Colin's parents hired a US-based private lab to do a review of Russia's autopsy of Colin to give their opinion if the autopsy was accurate or not. And this US-based lab pretty much immediately found that the Russian autopsy was not remotely accurate.
Where we shared our second chance. Sidewalk whispers still repeat in the rhythm of our hearts that beat.
Memory lane, where dreams align, is where every stone has a tale so fine.
Lamplight glowing soft and warm. Every dusk would weather the storm.
In treasured in this place. Windowsill and midnight breeze, caught in the branches of.
Number 1, Colin was not under the influence of alcohol or drugs. He was sober. Although technically he did have very small amounts of THC in his urine. THC is the chemical that is found in marijuana, but the amount was so little, it basically meant he had consumed the THC days before he went missing. And so he would not have been remotely affected by that small amount of THC in his system. Number 2, the lab determined that Colin almost certainly did not die from hypothermia. Instead, all signs pointed to Colin dying from being suffocated, meaning he was murdered, someone crushed his airway, or in some way restricted him from breathing, and that's what killed him. And 3, based on the lack of decomposition, the freshness of the injuries on Colin's body, and the lack of animal predation on his body when they found him, indicated that Colin did not just wander out of his cabin and immediately die somewhere in the forest. Instead, he was alive for most of the time people were looking for him. Meaning when they found him, he likely had died within hours of being found. And so these findings by this US-based lab kind of create a general theory about what must have happened to Colin. After Colin left the cabin in the early morning hours of March 28th, maybe to go to the outhouse or to go for a quick walk, when he went outside, someone or something was nearby, and they either lured Colin to them or they straight up ambushed Colin and took him away. Now, we have no idea what happened to Colin after he was abducted, but we can safely assume that after being abducted and taken somewhere, he was alive, and he stayed alive for several days until on the 8th day of his disappearance, Colin was killed, likely by his captor, either at the spot where he was found, or he was killed somewhere else, maybe in the forest, and then moved to the spot where he was found. Many people believe it was the Russian government who targeted Colin, they kidnapped him, and they killed him. And their botched investigation into his death was actually a calculated cover-up. Colin had participated in at least one peaceful environmentalist-led protest in Siberia, and after the protest, Colin apparently got a written warning by the Russian police not to attend another protest. But why would Colin, who was just one of many people involved in these protests, be singled out by the Russian government and killed for his participation? And why would the government elect to kill Colin when he was with 3 of his closest friends who would immediately notice his absence? It just doesn't add up. Today, Colin's parents are still trying to figure out what happened to their son, but unfortunately, their son's case is closed in Russia, and so no one on the Russian side is talking to the parents or giving them any new information. And so as a result, they and the rest of us are left to wonder who or what was lurking in the shadows when Colin stepped out of the cabin that morning. And then where did they take him, and what did they do to him for nearly a week before they killed him deep inside of that Siberian forest?
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, but in video format on our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it.